Protestants have tended to show their partisanship in honoring the Reformation with righteousness. But it's just as true, I think, that liberals, with their bias toward individualism and secularism, have glorified the Renaissance with almost religious overtones and have studied the Renaissance almost like Jews and Christians study the cradle of the Christian faith. So I appreciate an occasion when the period of the Reformation can be brought down to period of the Renaissance and Reformation can be brought down to a more human scale, and thus make it possible for us to have some fair perspective on the period that preceded it and the period that followed it, and I think improve our feel and experience and knowledge of the past considerably. The subject of witchcraft in the Renaissance is not an exotic topic we've pulled in from one of the corners of Cedar Avenue. It's a subject that has been well studied by some very fine historians, especially in the last decades. It gives insight into a broad view of the period, that it was a period that was suffering from rapid traumatic change and that reacted with some of the problems that are understandable in that time. It's a good idea that an occasion like this gives us a chance to enhance cooperation among the 5 colleges, which we hope can be done from time to time. And it's a good idea that we can introduce to Augsburg students and colleagues Dr. Charles Buzicky, one of our very respected colleagues in history among the 5 colleges. Dr. Buzicky is a recent PhD in medieval history from the University of Minnesota. His advisor was Professor Hoyt, Robert S. Hoyt. His thesis was in 12th century English studies. He teaches in medieval English history, and as in these colleges of this size in quite a broad area. Since some of those fields are fields that I'm familiar with, I know his good work and his good reputation, and I'm very pleased that Augsburg can have this acquaintance with him. He has taught the subject in 1 or 2 settings at St. Catherine's and has studied it otherwise too. There will be time at the close for some questions. Dr. Charles Buzicky.
I thank you all that is all of you at Augsburg, for extending to me this invitation to appear this afternoon. I'm especially grateful to the members of the history department with whom I've had long and very fruitful contacts, and I hope this will continue, especially after this afternoon. I just can't help but say one thing about the Cedar Avenue Straits. I almost had to leave my car over there, and it was fortunately that I brought along that other handy mark of my trade, which you see parked there. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to get here nearly so handily. Augsburg's parking is not, shall I say, as ecumenical as it might be. It probably isn't as economical as it might be either. Well, this afternoon, I want to suggest to you a few remarks about witchcraft in the Renaissance, which is, I think, truly an ecumenical kind of topic, because it really does bridge all manners and all forms of religious ideology and intellectual ideology as well. And I think perhaps the best place to begin a look at witchcraft is with a kind of document that began the whole business of witch thinking and witch hunting in a new form. In fact, some people suggest that this is the beginning of a witch craze, and a witch craze, as Professor Trevor Roper puts it, that lasted for about 2 centuries. Now, the beginning point then that I suggest for this consideration of witchcraft in the Renaissance is Pope Innocent VIII's bull promulgated in 1484, and it's usually referred to, as all papal documents are, by the first words of the bull, Summis Desiderantes. Now, I'm not going to bother translating all of that for you, but I will tell you what roughly was in it and what its import is. Pope Innocent VIII here was addressing himself to German prelates in whose diocese witchcraft was thought to be rife. And he laid down for the Inquisition the powers that were to be used for the suppression of witchcraft. And one of the most interesting parts of the document is the Pope's description of sorcerers' activities. Now, I'll just quote here from Pope Innocent, because in his own style he puts it so much better than I know I could. Now, he says, recently it's come to our notice, much to our regret, that in some parts of Upper Germany, in the provinces, towns, territories, localities, and sees of Mainz, Cologne, Salzburg, and Bremen, a number of persons of both sexes, forgetful of their own salvation, contrary to their belief in the Catholic faith, have given themselves up to devils in the form of incubi and succubi. By their incantations, spells, crimes, and infamous acts, these people destroy the fruit of the womb in women, in cattle, and various other animals. They destroy crops, vines, orchards, meadows and pastures, wheat, corn, other plants and vegetables. They bring pain and affliction, great suffering, and appalling disease upon men, women, and beasts, flocks, and other animals. They prevent men from engendering and women from conceiving. They render both wives and husbands impotent. They sacrilegiously deny the faith they received in the holy baptism, and they do not abstain from committing other fearful excesses and foul, vile crimes, endangering their souls, mocking God, and causing a serious scandal at the instigation of none other than the enemy, the devil. Well, I think you get some flavor of the Pope's indignation in that and his fear. Obviously, this was a phenomenon he saw very threatening, and it took, of course, forthright action on his part in order to do something about it. Now, 2 preaching friars then were sent as inquisitors to the areas concerned in the Pope's bull, mainly Germany, and they found that there was a certain amount of hostility, would you believe, between clergy and the people. In view of this, these inquisitors made representation to the Pope, who requested the Archbishop of Strasbourg provide the necessary facilities for the inquisitors to carry out their work. And they, of course, already had powers from Rome to do that. The practical work then of these 2 friars was very memorable. They were able to burn quite a few people as a result of some of their activities. But still more memorable, however, were the intellectual fruits, the resultant theories. Now, these 2 men then collaborated in writing a book called the Malleus Maleficarum. I'll refer to it frequently. It translates Hammer of Witches, and of course it's a testimony to the inquisitors themselves. And this is a lengthy legal work specifically concerned with the crime of witchcraft, that is, saying what witchcraft is all about as far as this period was concerned. It was first printed in 1486 and frequently reprinted from then onwards until the end of the 16th century. And it's a mine of information on witches and witchcraft both. Now, the theory of the Malleus, or rather of the 2 authors, I guess I should say, the authors were Heinrich Institor, whose German name was Kramer, in other words, Henry Kramer, and Jakob, or James Sprenger. So, Institor and Sprenger then put together this compilation, which was the culmination of the notion of the belief of the reality of magical actions. They enshrined the notion that magical actions had objective reality. The Malleus Maleficarum, was modeled on earlier inquisitorial handbooks, and it used scholastic organization and method, proceeding with questiones, then opposing arguments, and finally a conclusion. The document contributed very little that was original to the witch phenomenon of the time, but its careful organization and thorough argumentation, combined with the papal approval that accompanied it, fixed the whole system of witch beliefs in the mind of first the Inquisition and secondly society in general. Now, the authority of the Malleus placed those who would oppose the idea of witchcraft at a disadvantage for literally centuries to come. 2 precisely, and even more in some cases, in some places. The ideas of the Malleus were eagerly borrowed even by Protestants. Remember, this was a product of Catholic inquisitors. The Protestants wholeheartedly rejected other aspects of Catholicism, but took to the ideas of the Malleus. Witchcraft then continued to develop in the following centuries after its publication, but departures from and additions to the phenomenon as set in the Malleus were very minor indeed. Now, the purpose of the Malleus was systematically to refute all arguments against the reality of witchcraft. The authors maintain that many of the crimes alleged against witches, then, are objectively real. Some of the crimes are illusions, they admit, but these illusions were provoked, they say, by the devil at the behest or working with the witches. The Malleus subverts whatever skepticism, and there was a tradition of skepticism in Christendom about witch beliefs, whatever skepticism there was is subverted quite totally by the Malleus Maleficarum. Now, what was necessary for witchcraft? Three elements specifically necessary. One, an evil-intentioned witch, emphasis both on evil intention and on the witch. And the witch, the document will define as female. It's a fantastically sexist document. All the bad things you could say about women are to be found in the Malleus for sure. Well, maybe not everyone, but pretty many. Anyway, the first then the evil intention witch, the second the help of the devil, and third the permission of God, who though he hates evil allows it to occur, since without free will the potential with its possible potential for evil, men would have of course no potential for good. Now, witchcraft is the most evil of all crimes. It's worthy of the most severe punishment for its immediate, direct treason against God himself. This is, of course, according to the authors here. The particulars of witchcraft enumerated in the Malleus include almost all the characteristics associated with what has been described by many authors, many historians, as classical witchcraft. And the fact that these characteristics are enshrined in this document ensured that they would thereafter be accepted as authoritative. Now, in view of the fact that the authors were spreading their net very wide, one curious fact, I think, does emerge, and that is that they didn't mention such things that were associated with witch phenomena as familiar spirits or the obscene kiss or feasting and orgies of the Sabbath. There's no reference to witches or devil's mark. That's quite unusual indeed. Both of these marks became very common in trials of the next 2 centuries, and they figure in that play, The Crucible. There are some references. The Malleus authorized stripping and shaving of witches, but the purpose there was to determine whether they had amulets or charms hidden on their bodies, not to search for distinguishing witches' marks or devil's marks. The Malleus defined witchcraft further as the most abominable of all the heresies, and its 4 essential characteristics were the renunciation of the Christian faith, the sacrifice of unbaptized, that unbaptized is important, infants to Satan, the devotion of body and soul to evil, and sexual relationships with the devil. Witches have become servants of the devil by making an explicit pact with him. It involves a pact with the devil, such as you found, say, in Faust. And they engage in ritual copulation with Satan. That's a part of the idea here. They render homage to the devil. They use incantations, effect apparent changes in their shapes by means of diabolical illusion. They practice various forms of evil deeds. They are transvected through the air from place to place by the power of demons, and witches abuse the Christian sacraments in the most vile kinds of rites. They cook and eat children, either their own or those of others, and they use the children's flesh and bones to obtain a pretty horrible kind of salve or ointment, which they then employ in magical operations. That's quite a list. And the list, of course, called for, on the part of the authors, fairly rigorous methods of judicial procedures, a very wide latitude, in fact, of judicial procedure to deal with the phenomenon. And the Malleus, of course, details methods used and approved by Institor and Sprenger. Now, to deal with the devil and the diabolical, almost anything was, as you'd guess, permissible. An accusation leveled by an individual or the unproved denunciation of some zealous person normally could start a witch proceeding. Often a vague rumor could cause a judge to open a case. A child's evidence was quite adequate. Even statements made by personal enemies of the accused were accepted. The sentence ought to be straightforward, say the inquisitors, and it ought to be also brief and final. The judge's powers are suggested to be absolute, and the judge decides whether the accused has the right to defend himself even. The judge also appoints counsel for the defense and hedges that counsel with so many conditions that the counsel is virtually just another counsel for the prosecution. Torture may be freely employed. If the guilty party can't be made to confess, even under torture, even under duress, the failure to do so, of course, can be attributed to the devil's power over him. The accused can't escape the sentence, no way. Retraction and repentance are no way of avoiding the death penalty. Those under sentence are simply handed over to the secular authorities, that is, if the secular authority didn't initiate the proceeding in the first place, since witchcraft, of course, was a civil crime as well as a religious offense. Well, I think I've given you as good a rundown in this brief space that's available to me of the Malleus Maleficarum and its fairly wide-ranging ideas. This hammer of witches is enormously interesting and, of course, enormously disturbing as a work. Now, I think the most baffling fact about the theories of the Malleus wasn't their late appearance, because a lot of witch phenomena had gone on a long time, but rather the degree of acceptance that they received among the educated classes during their time. Fantastic acceptance during the 16th and 17th centuries. Most historians of witchcraft would agree that Europe produced no convincing antidote to the Malleus before the 18th century. Think of that, no convincing antidote before the 18th century. The consensus among Europe's intelligentsia generally accepted the system of witchcraft described in the Malleus, what I've just suggested to you, and that was throughout the period of the Renaissance and the Reformation. Gradually, those ideas were abandoned in the second half of the 17th century, but sometimes very, very reluctantly. No successful anti-Malleus was ever produced in these centuries, and that immediately, I think, raises the question, why was none produced? Or rather, why were those which were produced usually unconvincing? Before attempting an answer, I think another question may be in order, and that is, why did the Malleus, that perhaps overripe fruit of Catholic scholastic method, a summa, if you will, by Dominican inquisitors of the work of other Dominican inquisitors, why did that survive 60 years into the 16th century with such general acceptance? Considering the glee with which the Renaissance demolished productions of the scholastics and the violence with which the Reformation attacked the monastic orders and all their products, how could the Malleus manage to withstand this double assault until the moment when its validity was to be most severely tested and finally reaffirmed? Now, how could that happen? Well, we're going to try to look a little bit at that. Now, Renaissance humanism then reached its peak in the decades after the publication of the Malleus, and it did two important things with the theory of witchcraft which was presented to it. First, as one might expect, some prominent humanists displayed their wit and scholarship at the expense of this product of the old-fashioned schools. And I'll give you two examples. That prince of humanists, Erasmus of Rotterdam, number one, and number two, the famous legal humanist Andrea Alciati. Now, Erasmus had very little to say directly about witchcraft, and that may simply mean that he was seldom concerned about it, and for that I guess one can't exactly blame him. But his edition of the New Testament, as, for example, Professor Trevor Roper has noted, was consistently unhelpful to witch hunters at all of the potentially useful passages. On the lone occasion where he treated the subject at length, this is Erasmus now, Erasmus apparently accepted the wonders performed by a French sorcerer in 1501 as real. The wonders were real, but at the same time he went on to prove that the magician's pacts with the devil were a modern invention. These were unknown, said Erasmus, to Roman law or the earliest decretals of the popes. Erasmus introduces his story as a tragedy, not a comedy, and he closes it with the observation that we undergo new types of punishment in these days because we irritate God with new forms of evil. Fairly interesting idea from our friend Erasmus. So Erasmus's critical scholarship was at work only on the pedigree of the magical tricks that he talked about, and not upon the reality of the tricks themselves. On the other hand, Alciati, a founder of legal humanism, encountered witchcraft in his first recorded case in 1515, when he had to rule on the methods of certain Lombard inquisitors against whom some peasants had rebelled. He began by accepting that many of the accused women were either poisoners or blasphemers who had truly worshipped the devil and who thus deserved death. However, Alciati denied the inquisitors' thesis that the witches were really present at the diabolical sabbats. That reality he denied. Buttressing his arguments with citations from Horace and Augustine, he asked, why not believe that the devil danced with his own demons and the wives slept with their husbands? Why imagine real bodies in an imaginary frolic and imaginary bodies in a real bed? Sage and interesting questions, I think. They were really not pursued very much thereafter, unfortunately. Now, like Erasmus, Alciati did not go very far in attacking the system of witchcraft, although he did chip away at a little part. Some humanists, like Ulrich von Hutten in the Letters to Obscure Men, went farther and tried to kill these diabolical superstitions with ridicule, but such cases were very rare indeed. By and large, Renaissance humanism did not attack the central presuppositions of the system of witchcraft constructed by the Inquisition. This attitude was probably connected to the second major contribution of Renaissance thought to this subject, namely the separation of ignorant witchcraft from learned and innocuous magic. Now, the extent to which magic permeated the intellectual world view of the Renaissance is certainly well attested by historians today, thanks largely to the efforts of Garin and Thorndike, both authoritative on this subject. Very shortly after the appearance of the Malleus, Marsilio Ficino began publishing his attempts to develop a reformed Christian magic, which no longer depended upon demonic forces to produce its effects. White magic, in a new sense. No longer the benevolent activities of superstitious peasant women mixing good herbs to obtain occult cures. This new kind of magic was born, and it was meant to be a branch of higher learning. The Renaissance magician was the bearer of a higher and deeper wisdom. He considered himself as the antithesis of the old-fashioned and reprehensible sorcerer. That was too low-brow for any great Renaissance magician. In general, Renaissance writing about spiritual magic tried to clearly and systematically distinguish it from witchcraft, but it did not deny the reality or efficacy of black magic. Didn't deny the reality or efficacy there. Most of the demons, then, who inhabited the magical world of Renaissance Platonism were fairly harmless, but this didn't mean that there were no harmful demons. Now, the tension between good and bad demons, between white and black magic, was always latent. That is, it was always there in society and sometimes visible in the works of the great Renaissance magi. Probably the best illustration of the presence was the well-known and widely read De Occulta Philosophia of Cornelius Agrippa. Black magic kept creeping into the nooks and crannies of Agrippa's huge synthesis of occult practices, more openly and obviously than it did in many other summas of natural magic, such as Della Porta's. Doubtless this is why Agrippa remained in the popular imagination as the greatest sorcerer of all time, a role given to him, for example, by the great legal humanist Jean Bodin. He remained also the major source for do-it-yourself handbooks of black magic, and this gave him enormous influence. Agrippa's is the limiting case to show that Ficino's attempt to completely separate magic from witchcraft was really impossible. Now, if the Renaissance then tried harder to purify magic than to refute witchcraft, if it merely sniped at a few parts of the system of the Malleus, then surely the Reformation could do more. Papist superstitions were attacked with both religious zeal and scholarship, And was not Malleus-type witchcraft a recent doctrine, shaped by a corrupt church, unknown in many essential features, as Erasmus, for example, had shown to most Christian writers, early Christian writers? The Reformation had even less intention, however, of uprooting the current system of witchcraft than had the Renaissance. Martin Luther, that great religious genius, lived in a world governed by the devil and the devil's agents, and he writes about this very movingly. Luther's world was full of black magic. The older he got, the more witchcraft he saw. Catholic scholars, I blush to say, have lovingly collected his outbursts on this topic. You ought to appreciate that here. In his early career, Luther preached to his congregation, this is about 1516, that many people believe that witches ride on a broomstick or a ram or a donkey's head to some place or other where all the witches riot together as they please, but it's forbidden not only to do this, but to believe that it's done. Also, it's not permitted to believe that old women are changed into cats and swarm around at night. Now, within a decade, 1522, Luther was preaching that sorcerers or witches are the devil's whores who steal milk, raise storms, ride on goats or broomsticks, lame or maim people, torture babies in their cradles, change things into different shapes, so that a human being seems to be a cow or an ox, and force people into love and immorality. Not that the devil is unable to do these things by himself without sorcerers, for he's the Lord of the world, yet he will not act without human help. Now, what about Calvin? Calvin, much less vehement, I dare say, than Luther, was probably no more skeptical on the subject, although he spent much more time and eloquence in unmasking superstition, and even wrote an excellent treatise against astrology and divination. Like Erasmus, or Zwingli for that matter, Calvin apparently has little to say about sorcery, but what he did say indicates that he did not consider witchcraft as a form of superstition. He did little to encourage, but nothing to check a large witch hunt in Geneva in 1545, and he was genuinely frightened by the plague spreaders who were at the root of it all. Calvin knew that Satan could create nothing except illusions, and that enchantments are only lies. He despised Agrippa, our magician friend, and all the other magicians as well, but he clearly believed in many of the evils of witchcraft. The basic problem, I think, was that the reformers were inherently skeptical of the inquisitors' version of witchcraft, but they were also incapable of rejecting the core of the doctrine. Witchcraft, after all, was found in Scripture. And Scripture said unambiguously in Exodus 22:18 that thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Nowhere in the New Testament does the Spirit repudiate the law on this point. So the Reformers committed to Scriptura sola, Scripture alone, and they were soaked in it. They were led to reaffirm the law of Exodus. What else could they do? Now, while witchcraft per se, then, was not repudiated before 1560, there was some neglect of the Malleus, I must tell you, during the Reformation. Not the book itself, not some of the ideas, of course. This handbook of witchcraft went through 14 editions before 1521, but was next reprinted only in 1576 at Venice and then in 1580 at Protestant Frankfurt. Venice, of course, was Catholic. From 1580 to 1670, it went through a total of 15 editions. 15 additional ones, I should say. This long gap during the peak of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations contrasts sharply with the book's popularity before 1520 and after 1580. During this interval, Protestants apparently preferred to build their version of witchcraft on something other than a monastic account, while zealous Catholics worried about the book's influence in transferring witchcraft cases from the ecclesiastical courts to lay courts by its stress on the civil crimes of witches. It's quite noteworthy, by the way, that the Malleus was never printed in Spain, where church courts always maintained control of witchcraft cases. Now, during the pause in the popularity of the Malleus, the great debate of over the reality of the whole system of witchcraft was decided by some very influential literary humanists, some, I think, would say Renaissance dilettantes. And the outcome is, I think, central to our story. This debate reached its peak in the late 1570s. The main protagonists adhered to different religions, professions, and philosophies. We have a Lutheran physician who launched the debate, a Reformed physician, and an unorthodox Catholic lawyer who refuted the original position. And then another unorthodox Catholic philosopher claimed that both sides were arguing irrelevantly. Now we'll look at these positions. The first full-scale attack on the received doctrine about witchcraft was published in 1563 by a Protestant, Johann Weyer, a physician to the Duke of Cleves and Jülich. Weyer's attack on the witchcraft system was thorough and very lengthy. The most complete refutation of the Malleus until Balthasar Becker's Enchanted World appeared in the 1690s, well over a century later. Other attacks upon witchcraft, like that of the English squire Reginald Scott in 1584, were closely based upon Weyer. Weyer was the most important protagonist to be studied by other educated men who attempted to reestablish the basic system of witchcraft outlined in the Malleus, so he's focal to everybody's thought. Now, Weyer explained the amplitude of his attack and his main arguments in his preface, and I quote him, "My object is chiefly of a theological nature, to set forth the artfulness of Satan according to biblical authority, and to demonstrate how it can be overcome. Next, my object is philosophical. In that, I fight with natural reason against the deceptions which proceed from Satan and the crazy imagination of the so-called witches. My object is also medical, in that I will show illnesses which are attributed to witches come from natural causes. Finally, my object is legal, in that I speak of the punishment, other than the normal way, of sorcerers and witches." So 4 of those: theological, philosophical, medical, and legal. His central point, made a few paragraphs later, was that witches can harm no one through the most malicious will or the ugliest exorcism, but rather their imagination, inflamed, says Weyer, by demons in a way we don't understand, and the torture of melancholy makes the witches suppose that they've caused all sorts of evil. Now, Weyer's book then is divided into 6, his large book is divided into 6 lengthy, smaller books, each illustrating an important facet of his subject. First comes a book on the history and powers of the devil. Weyer explains that because this whole business is connected with the impostures and deceptions of devils, this part is primarily introductory and preparatory. Book 2 is about magicians, against whom Weyer is extremely severe. With the aid of the devil and through their own malice, these men dazzle us with their tricks, deceive people through various forms of divination. They most foully soil the divine teachings of medicine through their satanic tricks. Some doctors and surgeons hide their charlatanism by claiming that diseases which they can't cure must be magically caused. Weyer believes that all magicians are fools or knaves, mostly knaves, who should be very severely punished. Book 3, perhaps the most important, deals with witches themselves. Women who, because of their sex, are inconstant. Notice that sexism. Inconstant, of dubious faith, and because of their age, incapable of clear thought. So, weak, senile old women. They are especially vulnerable to the devil's wiles. He insinuates himself into their imagination, awake or asleep, through a variety of ghostly forms and apparitions, moving their humors and vital spirits to accomplish his purpose with remarkable cleverness. Thus, old women confess to crimes really done by the devil, while their minds are wounded, troubled, and disturbed by phantoms and apparitions in brains already addled by melancholy or by its vapors. Quite an interesting idea there that Weyer has. Weyer points out that these old women are very different from learned magicians. They have no books, no occult apparatus to summon the devil. He also argues that they are very different from the kind of poisoners, make a sharp distinction from the poisoners, whom the Greeks called pharmaka, and who were justifiably condemned to death by the Mosaic law and by many other ancient codes. Above all, Weyer stresses that witches are really only old women suffering from an excess of a disease of melancholia. I could have collected an infinity of examples here to show how senses are affected in many ways by the melancholic humor, or by its smoky vapors, he says. These smoky vapors infect the seat of the mind, and from which all the fantastic monsters spring. The devil, with God's permission, can thus easily trouble the senses, stir up the humors and vapors which are useful to him, after choosing the complexion, age, sex, or other internal and external things through which new figures, conceived by the powers of the imagination, are often communicated by the nerves to the optical faculty. Wow, that's really fun. Such that many dare to swear by their very lives that they've seen or done things which never happened in nature. Thus, Weyer attempts to sketch out a complete natural explanation for the behavior of women accused of witchcraft. These women suffer from their own depraved imaginations, craftily manipulated by the devil. All crimes attributed to them, even those to which they confess, are imaginary, in the sense that they have not done them, but the devil, of course, has done them. Weyer's witches make no pacts, attend no Sabbaths. These, too, are deceptions of the devil, working through the melancholic imagination of the women. Book 4 treats the victims of witches and witchcraft, showing that they're tormented by devils or possessed by devils, you can take your choice, with the occult permission of God, but without any cooperation from witches or humans. Book 5 describes the cures for people thus tormented. Weyer boasts that his treatments are totally different from those heretofore employed. He rejects all illicit cures based primarily on white magic and confines his suggestions to prayer and orthodox medicine. Finally, moved to pity and also furor by the punishments currently inflicted upon witches, Weyer wrote his 6th book, as he says, as a kind of addendum to the other 5. His advice is based primarily upon his sharp distinction between witches and poisoners. He agrees that the poisoners should undergo the full rigors of Mosaic and other laws, but the witches, who are seduced by the devil through melancholic torments, are not heretics and should not be punished, but simply purged. Weyer ended his book, then, by protesting that his arguments were merely hypotheses. I don't claim to be absolutely certain of everything I say in this book. He also predicted that he would fall into the bad graces of some learned and sensible men, especially academic philosophers and theologians for having written the book. He was, of course, correct in predicting that his book would provoke violent refutation, but he showed somewhat less foresight in predicting the direction from which it would come. Among the many rebuttals to Weyer, and only the 2 most important and intellectually powerful will be mentioned here, those from Thomas Erastus, professor of medicine at Heidelberg, and from Jean Bodin, French jurist and author. Erastus and Bodin possessed 2 of the keenest minds of all Renaissance writers in the second half of the 16th century. Both are best known today for their contributions to political theory, and neither has yet found a biographer capable of dealing with the full range of his intellectual interests. Both men saw serious shortcomings and fallacies in Weyer's hypothesis about witchcraft. Erastus's attack on Weyer was originally published in 1572, and to what did he object? Well, first, he did not object to Weyer's demonstrations that witches cannot really perform the various deeds of wickedness commonly attributed to them. He agrees that such deeds are the work of devils, not witches. But Erastus emphatically does not agree that it follows from this that witches are innocent and should not be punished. He denies that witches are insane or otherwise irresponsible in their dealings with the devil. He denies that their brains have been befuddled by visions, produced by melancholic vapors, and how he denies that. On the contrary, Erastus says that witches do make a manifest pact and alliance with the devil. They incite devils to perform black magic by virtue of this pact. Thus, witches are not passive instruments, but in a real sense, authors and instigators of evil doing. He adds that they are worse than magicians, who at least have no overt alliance with the demons, but only an occult alliance. In other words, they don't know about the alliance, and who falsely think they can compel the demons to do their will. In other words, witches' commerce with the devil is not imaginary, as Weyer had asserted, and their punishment, the punishment of the witches, accordingly is just. Furthermore, Erastus objects to Weyer's interpretations of Scripture and antiquity. His first reason for punishing witches is that God expressly commanded it in Exodus. And God was talking about witches, not about poisoners, as Weyer gratuitously suggested. At the close of the dialogue, Erastus repeats that witches should be put to death simply for idolatry, if for no other reason. Who is so impudent as to deny that sorcerers are idolaters, he asks. Throughout his discussion, Erastus seemed to be following a central line of Calvinist thought about witchcraft, namely that idolatry, or devil worship, is the truly serious crime involved here, rather than the superstitious incantations by which witches claim to harm their enemies. In his 1578 dialogue, a revision of some of his earlier work, Erastus refutes Weyer's naturalistic explanations for witches' behavior even more thoroughly than he had in 1572. As a fellow physician, he brought his own empirical evidence and common sense to bear on the problem. Obviously, Erastus says, not all witches are melancholic, just as all women aren't melancholic. Although melancholic imagination is very strong, and some of the witches' dreams are caused by it, nevertheless, two things argue against Weyer. First, the existence of non-melancholic witches, or witches who are obviously not affected by melancholia at other times. And second, the remarkable uniformity of the visions confessed to by witches. How could the witches possibly imagine the same odd things under so many different circumstances? So Erastus once more concludes that witches' pacts and Sabbaths are not imaginary. Now, these arguments were less thorough and less widely read than the refutation that was published somewhat later, a couple years later, in Paris by Baudin. This time, Weyer was attacked by name. Erastus had referred to the arguments of Weyer, but not to his name. And Baudin has considerably more malice. He is indeed a master polemicist. Now, Baudin's polemic sprang naturally from his view of reality as the congruence of ancient and modern evidence, of authority and experience. Baudin's attitude toward witchcraft was no intellectual aberration, but an important part of a consistent worldview. Since his mind was logical and his memory was prodigiously stocked, his demolition of Weyer's hypotheses merit some careful attention. Baudin attacked Weyer partly for the honor of God, says he, and partly in order to reconvert any secular judges who may have been led astray by Weyer's sophistries. Such opinions as Weyer's, says Baudin, must come from either ignorance or wickedness. Before he finishes the refutation, Baudin tries to have his cake and eat it too, have it both ways, to show that Weyer was both ignorant and wicked. He has two principal arguments to prove that his opponent is wicked, two to prove him ignorant, and finally a major point wherein he's both ignorant and wicked. Now, Weyer's wicked, argues Baudin, because he patently practices black magic himself. Citations from his books show how he reaches 1,000 damnable sorceries, up to the point of printing the words, invocations, figures, circules, and letters used by the greatest sorcerers who ever lived, which I can't read, says Baudin, without horror. Weyer has also compiled a list of the world's most important sorcerers in order to guide the curious, and at one point he had even dared to print the inventory of the diabolical monarchy, with the names and surnames of 72 princes and over 7 million devils. Now, in all these matters, Baudin pointed out, Weyer went way beyond his master, Cornelius Agrippa, who never dared print such recipes for raising devils in his book on occult philosophy. So Weyer is not an opponent of sorcery, but a teacher of sorcery, and a singularly impudent one at that. Now, the second argument for the wickedness is his position that witches, so long as they had not poisoned anyone, should not be punished by the secular law. As a lawyer, Baudin exploded. He angrily pointed out that Weyer didn't deny the existence of diabolical evil deeds, but merely denied that witches were responsible for them, thus placing the real criminals beyond the reach of the law. Judges cannot bring Satan into court, said Baudin, but they can diminish the scope of his power by removing from him the witches who help him, pray to him, pay him homage, carry out his instructions. Weyer had also argued that repentant witches should not be punished. Baudin replied that human and divine law saw the matter quite differently. When God told David that his sin was forgiven, he was nonetheless well punished, says Baudin. Baudin makes Weyer look something like the Watergate defense lawyer who wants to argue that the small fry should be spared because they only followed the orders of the chief executive, who is beyond the law's grasp, or else that because they've turned state's evidence, they are no longer guilty of anything. Boldly, Baudin accused Weyer of ignorance in the field of medicine. He specifically refutes his rival's arguments about the melancholia from which witches suffer. Because Weyer's a physician, he cannot but know that women's humor is directly contrary to adult melancholia, from which this furor comes. Furthermore, melancholics are seldom found in northern climates anyway, whereas North Germany and the Alpine lands are amazingly full of witches, as Weyer himself knows. Thus it becomes a notable incongruity to attribute melancholic diseases to women. Second, and perhaps more serious, Baudin accuses Weyer of philosophical ignorance in his treatment of the various marvels produced by devils. First, he clearly establishes that Weyer doesn't deny such marvels. Indeed, his books teem with specific examples of them. Furthermore, Weyer does not deny the devil's ability to make hail, to make harm, to ban beast and the fruits of the earth. But, Baudin continues, one can say that the witches, by their prayers and abominable sacrifices, are partly responsible for the calamities which we see. Even Weyer confesses, speaking about a witch from Cleves, that the persecutions of passers-by at her home, from unknown reasons, ceased as soon as she was burned. This shows sufficiently that she was the principal cause of such persecutions, because the effect ceased when the cause was removed. And the general maximum in all sciences is that the effects cease when the cause ceases. Weyer is guilty of other forms of philosophical confusion as well, says Baudin. For example, Baudin ridicules his rival's definition of a witch because it explains her in terms of things that she doesn't do, whereas a real definition ought to point right at a thing and explain its essence. Elsewhere, Baudin claims that Weyer's arguments are all built upon a ruinous foundation. When he disputes of spirits and demons and of their actions as if they were natural things, which is to confound heaven and earth. Thus, Weyer is guilty of several weaknesses. He admits effects while denying causes. He contradicts himself. He confuses the natural with the supernatural. And he can't even define his terms properly. On top of it all, he's an ignorant physician. Finally, Baudin bitterly indicts Weyer as a blasphemer, a matter in which he was both ignorant and wicked. This charge stems mainly from Weyer's exegesis of Exodus 22:18 and other scriptural texts as well, whose clear sense he obscured by claiming that only poisoners and not witches were condemned to death by Mosaic law. Baudin argues at length that Weyer has falsified Scripture and is thus guilty of the worst kind of impiety. And modern biblical scholars, by the way, support Baudin's contentions about the correct reading of the Hebrew text. Baudin concluded then that Weier's errors come far more from wickedness than from ignorance. He could not, for example, bring himself to believe that his opponent was really so ignorant about melancholia. And he honestly thought that Weyer was a blasphemer, sorcerer, teacher of witchcraft, and as such deserved the full treatment of the law. So much for Baudin, great legal scholar and rigorous thinker. While Baudin was publishing his reputation of Weyer, another French jurist, who had retired for almost a decade, produced a radically different approach to the whole question of witchcraft. This is, of course, Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne admitted in his essays that he could offer no rational explanation for the deeds to which so many witches had confessed, but that nevertheless he did not believe the witches. He did not accuse his opponents of holding a false opinion, but only a difficult and rash one. Montaigne then goes on to relate how, a few years ago, I passed through the lands of a sovereign prince, who, as a favor to me and to beat down my incredulity, did me the kindness of showing me, in his own presence and in a private place, 10 or 12 prisoners of this nature, witches, of course, and especially one old woman, a real witch in ugliness and deformity, long famous in her profession. I saw both proofs and free confessions, and some barely perceptible mark or other on this wretched old woman, and I talked and asked questions as much as I wanted. And I'm not the man to let my judgment be throttled much by preconceptions. In the end, in all conscience, I would have prescribed hellebore rather than hemlock, says Montaigne. As for the objections and arguments which worthy men have brought against me, I have not felt that any are binding and do not admit of some solution more likely than their conclusions. It's true indeed that proofs and reasons founded on experience and fact I do not attempt to disentangle. Moreover, they have no end to take hold of. I often cut them as Alexander did his knot. After all, it's putting a very high price on one's conjectures to roast a man alive for them. Now, Montaigne's skepticism, then, was the eventual escape route used by Christendom's secular authorities in witchcraft cases: eternal doubt. Here's the real source of Cartesian thought, which has often been given credit for destroying intelligent people's belief in witchcraft. Montaigne's position was adopted by the ruling classes of England and France in the second half of the 17th century. It was also adopted in Germany during the early 18th century. But it's important to remember that Montaigne's influence was considerably in the future and not in the present. This man, as he himself said, merely cut the Gordian knot of witchcraft. He did not propose a counter-explanation as Weyer had done. His skepticism is a priori and is not even shaken by exposure to facts, such as the dozen confessed witches with their marks. Where Baudin, or for that matter Weyer, tended to believe almost everything he heard or read, Montaigne was prepared not to believe what he had seen. It was a bold posture, philosophically tenable, but psychologically difficult to maintain. For the basic fact about witchcraft in Europe after 1600 is its remarkable extension. In persuading responsible secular authorities about the reality of witchcraft, Erastus and Baudin succeeded while Weyer failed, because no important new arguments were produced by either side for a full century after this debate. The defenders of the system of the Malleus and of the literal meaning of Exodus had by far the better of the argument.
One consequence of this was an enormous increase in witchcraft trials in Western Europe, with consequent burnings and other executions. In the vast majority of regions, the persecutions reached their peak somewhere between about 1580 and 1650. Well, why did the defenders of witchcraft win the debate? From one angle, the answer, I think, is extremely simple. The bulk of ancient and modern evidence was on their side. Witches did exist. Moses condemned them. So did modern rulers, partly for the same reasons. But even more important than the evidence was the ways in which it could be explained. Perhaps the best way to classify possible explanations would be through the four great faculties of Christendom's universities: theology, philosophy, medicine, law. At first glance, this may seem to be only one more avenue of confusion through an already confused subject, since really thorough discussions of witchcraft like Weier's or Baudin's necessarily touched upon all four professions. But it will become clearer if one begins with theology and law. Remember that the Malleus was constructed by scholastic theologians, and that witchcraft was accepted by Protestant theology because of scriptural evidence. No important 16th century theologian attempted to refute witchcraft, and perhaps the weakest single part of Weier's argument came when he ventured onto theological ground. From theology, law was converted to belief in witchcraft. This did not happen without some resistance early in the century. Alciati was not an isolated case, and Erasmus's doubts about the punishment of sorcerers came from the history of civil and canon law. In the 1530s, a papal judge, Guerilandus, even considered lawyers as the most skeptical profession on the subject of witchcraft. But at this point, the lawyers began to change their minds. The great breakthrough came with the articles punishing harmful witchcraft with death in the famous imperial law code of 1532, called the Carolina. English common law under Henry VIII followed suit in 1541. With some exaggeration, Professor Trevor Roper claims that by 1600, lawyers are more savage, more pedantic than the clergy, as far as witchcraft is concerned. The same conservative spirit which had once resisted the novelty involved in witchcraft and witch ideas was now venerated, and now venerated the established doctrine. Although Montaigne was not an isolated case among French lawyers, nonetheless Baudin, also a lawyer, was a far more representative spokesman for the legal profession. Thus, any attempts to overthrow the system of witchcraft would have to come from either medicine or philosophy. Official philosophy, whether Aristotelian or Platonist, offered little leverage to would-be opponents of witchcraft. The Neoplatonic universe swarmed with demons who might be either good or bad. Aristotelianism seemed to bypass the question. Of course, there were some attempts, like Pomponazzi's essay on incantations, which tended to undermine some of the foundations of witchcraft. But on the other hand, Cesalpino was able to construct an Aristotelian explanation for the reality of demons as late as 1580. Erastus was an orthodox Aristotelian. For the moment, then, philosophy had no clear and obvious system to erect against witchcraft. She would have one in the next century, with mechanism buttressed by Cartesian doubt, but all this was in the future. Only medicine was left as a profession which could do battle against witchcraft, and from medicine came the lone 16th century opponent of the whole system. But even this profession had its intellectual Achilles heel, at which his astute opponents struck. And this, of course, was the melancholic imagination, which formed the base of Weier's attempts to shape a natural explanation for the behavior of people accused of witchcraft. And this was, of course, something that Baudin and Erastus both were able to perceive, that is the weakness of this system, and they were able to demolish it fairly successfully. If witches were not merely suffering from temporary insanity induced by an excess of melancholia, then they must be devil worshippers and blasphemers whose antics would directly or indirectly cause enormous harm to man and beast. So Baudin the lawyer, firmly supported by theology, with the benevolent neutrality of philosophy, profiting from a serious weakness within his opponent's own profession, routed Weyer the physician. As the lawmakers of Saxony said in 1572 while decreeing the death penalty for white, this is non-harmful, as well as for black witchcraft, Weyer's reasonings are not very important, for he's a physician and not a jurist. So, in sum, I hope I've suggested that the intellectual climates of Renaissance thinking in the 16th century proved rather unsuccessful in attempting to demolish the vast system of witchcraft that was erected by the Malleus Maleficarum. In fact, they were so successful that the lid was on very much change in the whole system for almost 2 centuries. I'm afraid I've taken more time than I'd intended, but I can only now apologize for having done so and leave you ask any questions such as I might be able to help you with.
What difference do you see, or have you done any comparison with witchcraft among Catholic clergy, say, of the 18th century with the 16th? I think you've done some in your paper. Is it continued among missionaries who go out to the province?
No, well, actually, yes, it did continue. Some of these ideas do carry over into the 18th century. In other words, the period of the settlement, say, of the New England colonies, meant that the witchcraft ideas that were present in England at the time were transferred to the colonies, and you find that phenomenon in the whole Salem business. The
reason I asked, would northern Italian missionaries be infected by this?
Some were, yes.
Will you just break a minute, and those of you who have class could go, and the rest of us could gather here for a few minutes for question and answer?